the cuckold of any Tianwei-Chus, very useful war and trumps, inflated ego, a catastrophic romance in the key of revelation, being a complete and unabridged account of how two men loved each other into the abyss, and called it foreign policy. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Revelation 13:1. He's a great man. He's been through a lot. They've been after him for years. Donald J. Trump on Benjamin Netanyahu, 2025. The court case is a distraction. What Bibi needs is focus. I give him focus. Donald J. Trump, who has never in his life given anyone focus. Prologue. In the beginning was the deal. Before we begin, understand this. Every great romance requires 2 people who are fundamentally unsuited to loving anyone but themselves, who find in each other not a compliment, but a confirmation, a mirror that flatters, a voice that echoes, an audience that never leaves. Every great catastrophe requires the same. The romance between Donald John Trump, 45th and 47th President of the United States of America, and Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, on and off, forever, like a rash that becomes a permanent condition. This romance is the catastrophe. It is the romance of the catastrophe. It is a love story, the way Pompeii is a love story. Technically beautiful, historically significant, and conducted entirely under a volcano that everyone could see, but no one in the relevant positions chose to mention. They found each other the way powerful men always find each other, not through loneliness, but through utility, not through vulnerability, but through the mutual recognition of a particular type of genius. The genius of the perpetual escape, the genius of the political resurrection, the genius of turning every accusation into a campaign slogan, and every crisis into a rope ladder out of the hole you dug yourself. Both men had been pronounced dead, politically, legally, morally, more times than a cat has lives, and more times than the Bible has plagues. Both men had returned, each time slightly angrier, slightly more indispensable to their respective bases, and absolutely certain that the universe owed them not merely survival, but triumph. This is the story of what happens when 2 such men find each other across the Atlantic, across the rubble of the Middle East, across the long transatlantic phone lines that connect a golf resort in Florida to a bunker in Jerusalem. This is the story of Hell 2. It has features the original Hell never imagined. It has a PR team. Book I, the courtship, or 2 narcissists find a mirror in the wreckage of the world. Chapter 1, the man who would not die, portrait of any Tianwei-Chu. In the beginning, there was Bibi. Not in the beginning, not the Genesis beginning. Though Netanyahu had been in politics long enough that some of his oldest enemies had begun to suspect a supernatural explanation for his durability. But in the beginning of this story, there was Bibi, 60-something years old, silver-haired, deep-voiced, possessed of the particular charisma that belongs to men who have spent so long in rooms where decisions are made that they have begun to smell faintly of power itself, a combination of adrenaline and expensive suits and the cologne of consequence. He had been prime minister before. He had been removed. He had returned. He had formed coalitions with people he despised in order to defeat people he despised more. He had promised things he did not deliver and delivered things he had not promised, and survived the difference with the equanimity of a man for whom survival is not a strategy, but a metabolic function, as automatic as breathing, as unconscious as a heartbeat. In 2020, they charged him bribery, fraud, breach of trust. In case 1000, he had received gifts from billionaires, cigars, champagne, jewelry, in exchange for regulatory favors. In case 2000, he had negotiated with a newspaper publisher for favorable coverage in exchange for suppressing a competitor. In case 4000, the most serious, he had corrupted the regulatory environment of a telecommunications company in exchange for billions of shekels worth of favorable news coverage on a website that reached millions of Israelis. The man had essentially attempted to purchase his own mythology. He had tried to buy the story of himself, and the courts had noticed. For 4 years, the trial ground on. Netanyahu attended hearings between cabinet meetings. He sat in the dock between press conferences. He maintained the extraordinary double life of a man who was simultaneously the head of state and the defendant, who was simultaneously indispensable and accused, who was, in the truest sense, governing from inside a legal trap of his own construction. And every time the trap seemed about to close, every time the coalition seemed about to fracture, every time the polls seemed about to turn, every time the gavel of history seemed about to fall, something happened. A new political crisis, a new realignment, a new emergency that made it unseemly, unpatriotic, dangerous to pursue the trial of the man at the country's helm. And now there was a war, and Bibi, who understood war the way a chess grandmaster understands the board, not with love, not with hatred, but with the cold and terrible clarity of a man who sees every piece as a variable, looked at the war, and understood that it was, among other things, useful. He reached for the phone. He called Florida. Chapter 2. The man who made gravity optional portrait of Trump. Across the ocean in the Republic of Mar-a-Lago. A sovereign territory governed by its own laws, its own economics, its own physics, in which the normal rules of consequence had been declared unconstitutional sometime around 2016. Donald Trump was receiving a phone call. He was always receiving phone calls, or giving them, or about to give them. Trump existed in a permanent state of telecommunication, a node in a global network of flattery and transaction, and the specific kind of international friendship that requires one party to to need something, and the other party to enjoy being needed enormously. Trump was 78 years old, or 79. The number was less important than the impression, which was of a man who had decided, at some point in his 6th decade, to simply stop aging in any direction that implied weakness, and instead to age in all the directions that implied force. Louder, larger, more certain, more orange, more absolutely convinced of his own centrality to the universe's continuing operation. He had been president. He had lost. He had insisted he had won. He had sent a crowd to a building. He had been impeached twice. He had faced criminal charges in multiple jurisdictions. He had faced civil judgment. He had faced the full machinery of American justice, which had tried repeatedly and with considerable resources to make him accountable. And he had escaped, not because he was innocent, but because he was fast, in the way that a man who controls the narrative is always faster than the man who controls the evidence. He had returned to the presidency. They called it a comeback. He called it a correction. He called it, specifically, one of the greatest political miracles in history, maybe the greatest. People are saying it's the greatest. The people saying this were his staff. But no matter. He picked up the phone. Chapter 3. The first call, or the physics of mutual need. The first serious call between them. Not the ceremonial calls of congratulation and alliance, but the real call, the one that smells of need, began, as all their calls began, with Trump speaking for 6 minutes without being interrupted. He spoke about Iran, about strength, about the deals he had made, was making, would make, about how nobody understood Iran like he did, how he had people, how the Iranians were afraid of him specifically, how under Obama, he always circled back to Obama, the way a tongue circles back to a loose tooth. The world had been weak, and now the world was strong, because he was strong, and strength was what you needed, and he had it uniquely, historically, in quantities unmatched by any previous leader of any previous civilization. Netanyahu, who had spent his career in rooms full of generals and intelligence chiefs, who also believed they were the smartest person present, listened to all of this with the patience of a man disarming a bomb, careful, precise, waiting for the exact moment to insert the thing he had called to insert. It came during a pause for breath. Donald, said Netanyahu. Not Mr. President, not sir, but Donald. The intimacy calculated to the millimeter. I need to tell you something about what's happening here with the court case. And Trump, who had the attention span of a man watching 6 televisions simultaneously, suddenly had the focus of a predator, because Trump understood court cases. Trump understood, in the cellular, pre-intellectual way that people understand the things that have shaped their lives, exactly what it meant to have lawyers as your primary companions, to have the judiciary as your permanent landscape, to wake every morning and feel the weight of a system that had decided you should be held accountable. He understood it, and he hated it, And now here was his friend Bibai, feeling the same thing. And this was a bond that went deeper than policy. This was solidarity. This was, in its way, love. Book Roman 2. The 7 seals of their holy alliance. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof. Nobody worthy came forward. 2 men who were emphatically not worthy came forward instead. The angel, who had been standing there for quite a while, decided this would have to do. The first seal, the indictment that would not cooperate. The first seal was broken not with a trumpet, but with a subpoena. And the subpoena was Israeli, and it had Netanyahu's name on it, and his name had been on it for 4 years. And the situation had become what legal scholars call untenable, and what Netanyahu called politically motivated, and what Trump, when he heard about it, called a witch hunt, using, without irony, his own most precisely autobiographical phrase. "They're doing to you what they did to me, Bibai," Trump said, on one of the calls that would later be described by people who had been in the room as remarkable. In the same way that a tornado is remarkable, technically impressive, historically notable, and something you would rather have experienced from a greater distance. It's the deep state, Trump continued. Every country has a deep state. Israel's deep state is the judiciary. Same as here. Same playbook. Netanyahu did not correct this analysis, which was not accurate, but was useful. He let it sit. He let Trump's certainty fill the room the way smoke fills a room, slowly, thoroughly, until there was no air left that wasn't his friend's absolute conviction. And then he guided the conversation with the precision of a surgeon who has performed this particular operation many times toward the specific request. He did not make it a request. He never made anything a request. He made it a shared conclusion, something they had arrived at together, something the logic of the situation demanded. "The trial is a distraction," Netanyahu said. "Every hour I spend on the trial is an hour I'm not spending on the war. And the war is what matters. The war is what you and I are both focused on." Trump agreed immediately. Trump always agreed immediately with things he had been maneuvered into agreeing with. Because part of his genius was the ability to experience being maneuvered as self-determination. He called Isaac Herzog a disgrace. He said it to Axios. He said it to the world. He said, "I don't want anything on Bibai's mind other than fighting against Iran. Every day I talk to Bibai about the war. I want him to focus on the war and not on the fucking court case." And the courtroom shuddered. Not physically. The building was solid, Jerusalem limestone, ancient and patient. But something in the architecture of Israeli civil society felt the tremor, the specific tremor of a foreign superpower inserting itself into domestic jurisprudence, of the most powerful man in the world calling the rule of law a distraction, of the implicit message sent to every judge and every lawyer and every citizen watching. The man you are trying to hold accountable has a friend who thinks accountability is the enemy of security. The first seal had been broken. Where it landed, nothing immediately grew, but the ground had shifted. The second seal, the budget that held a gun to everything. The second seal concerned money, which is to say it concerned power, which is to say it concerned everything. By law, Israeli law, democratic law. The kind of law that is supposed to prevent any single person from holding permanent power through permanent crisis. The Prime Minister's coalition had to pass a budget by the end of the month. If they failed, the government would fall. New elections would be called, and in new elections, Netanyahu might lose, and in losing, he might face a legal situation in which his trial would no longer be managed by political allies, in which the judiciary might actually reach a verdict, in which the word guilty might be applied to his name in permanent ink. So the budget had to pass, but the budget could not pass because 18 seats in the coalition were held by the ultra-Orthodox parties. The Haredim, the devout, the men in black coats who had built, over decades of Israeli coalition politics, a system of extraordinary leverage, a situation in which their theological commitments had become the load-bearing wall of secular government. And the ultra-Orthodox parties would not vote for the budget unless Netanyahu legislated an exemption from military service for yeshiva students. Let this sit for a moment. Israel was at war, multi-front, existential by some analyses. Young men and women were being mobilized, were fighting, were dying, were coming back altered in the ways that soldiers come back altered. The country was under extraordinary military and psychological pressure. Every capable body was, in principle, needed, except the yeshiva students. The yeshiva students would continue to study. They would continue to pray. They would continue to live in the specific universe that the ultra-Orthodox community had constructed, separate, insular, subsidized, exempt. While other people's children fought the war that the Prime Minister was using to exempt himself from trial, and Netanyahu needed those 18 votes, so he would give them what they wanted. This was the second seal. The budget as hostage, the war as excuse, the exemption as price, the living as coin. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. The sword, in this case, was a legislative rider. It was effective nonetheless. The third seal, the war itself, which was real, which is why this is complicated. Here we must pause, because the war was real. This is the part of the catastrophic romance that the satirist must handle with care, because it is easy, it is dangerously easy to see Netanyahu's political manipulation of the war and conclude that the war itself is therefore manipulation, and this conclusion would be both morally convenient and factually incomplete. People were dying, not as metaphor, not as political variable, not as the abstraction that powerful men in bunkers and golf resorts use when they discuss military operations over the phone, casualties, collateral, attrition, theater, but as human beings, fathers and mothers and soldiers and civilians, dying in the specific and irreversible way that human beings die when ordnance lands in proximity to their bodies. Iran and its proxies had spent decades building a ring of fire around Israel, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria, and the ring had tightened and then caught, and now the fire was real, and the people in it were real, and no amount of political analysis made the dead less dead. This is what Netanyahu understood that his critics sometimes forgot. The crisis was genuine, and he was exploiting it. These facts were not in contradiction. In fact, they were the whole point. The exploitation was most effective precisely when the crisis was most genuine. If the war were not real, the justification for pausing the trial would not be convincing. The reality of the danger was the mechanism of the escape. The war was the third seal, and the third seal was the most terrible because it was the most honest. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. The balances weighed political survival against military necessity, and found them, in Netanyahu's hands, to be the same weight. Whether they were was the question that would outlast all of them. The fourth seal, Trump SPAKS2, the world about things he has been told once. The fourth seal was the public intervention. Trump going on record. Trump inserting himself into Israeli civil society with the confidence of a man who has been briefed by one interested party and considers this comprehensive research. Every day I talk to Bibi about the war, he told Axios, and this was true, and in its truth contained the entire architecture of the problem. Every day, Bibi the war, Trump was receiving the world through Netanyahu's voice. He was receiving the legal situation through the filter of a man who had an existential stake in how the legal situation was characterized. He was receiving the war through the strategic consciousness of a man who had, in the privacy of his own calculations, already identified the war's political utility. And Trump, who was not unintelligent, but who was incurious, who had the specific intellectual limitation of a man who trusts his instincts absolutely, and therefore sees the information that confirms his instincts as real information, and the information that complicates them as fake information, absorbed all of this and produced, as output, public statements that served Netanyahu's domestic agenda with the precision of a weapon custom built for the target. He called Herzog a disgrace. Isaac Herzog, former Labor Party leader, ceremonial president, a man whose job was largely symbolic and who had been asked by Netanyahu to grant a pardon and had declined, was called a disgrace by the President of the United States because a man who needed a pardon had told his friend the President that the man declining to give it was a disgrace. This was the fourth seal, the superpower as megaphone, the alliance as amplifier, the friendship as a force multiplier for the specific kind of injustice that wears the costume of security. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. Hell followed. Hell always follows. Hell had excellent logistics. The fifth seal, the MARTYRS, asked how long. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?" The martyrs in this version were not saints. They were a soldier in his 20s who had been mobilized from his job, his family, his life, to fight a war while the prime minister who sent him was negotiating his own legal survival over secure telephone lines to Florida. They were a secular Israeli taxpayer watching the ultra-Orthodox community receive military exemption in exchange for 18 legislative votes in a budget negotiation that would keep the prime minister in power long enough to manage his trial. They were an Israeli citizen who had believed, who had been taught to believe, who had organized their entire civic identity around the belief that Israel was a democracy in which the law applied equally, in which security did not excuse corruption, in which the extraordinary did not become the permanent simply because the permanent was more convenient for the man at the top. They asked how long. The answer came back through the apparatus of power, through the press offices, and the coalition whips, and the American president's Twitter feed, and the security cabinet's carefully worded statements, as long as necessary, as long as the situation requires, as long as we are at war, and we are always at war. The sixth seal, the love language of transaction. And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. The sixth seal was the love language. Every relationship has one. Acts of service, words of affirmation, quality time, gift giving. Trump and Netanyahu's love language was transaction, and they spoke it fluently, without accent, with the ease of mother tongue. Trump gave public statements, pressure on Israeli institutions, the implicit backing of American power, the explicit backing of American rhetoric, the specific and devastating gift of treating Israeli jurisprudence as an obstacle to American strategic goals. Netanyahu gave the feeling that Trump craved above all other things, above money, and above power, and above legacy. The feeling of being necessary, of being the one person whose involvement made the difference, of being the fulcrum on which the fate of civilizations turned. Nobody understands the Middle East like Donald, Netanyahu would say, in the specific tone that translated roughly as, nobody needs to feel like they understand the Middle East more than Donald, and I can provide that feeling at competitive rates. Bibi's been through hell, Trump would say, in the specific tone that translated roughly as, I see in Bibi what I am and what has been done to me, and I will protect him with the same ferocity with which I protect my own story. This was not cynicism dressed as love. This was something more frightening. It was genuine. They genuinely needed each other. They genuinely provided each other with what they needed. Transaction was real, and the feeling underneath the transaction was real. And this is what made it so resistant to critique. Because you could point to the interests, you could map the mutual benefit, you could lay it all out in a diagram that would convince any rational observer, and you would be right. And you would also have missed the thing underneath, which was two old men who felt persecuted and had found in each other the one person on earth who said, you're right. They're after you. I understand. I'm with you. The earthquake of the sixth seal was this, that the corruption of power is rarely cold. It is usually warm. It is usually comfortable. It is usually wrapped in something that feels, from the inside, like friendship. The seventh seal, silence. And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour, 30 minutes. In 30 minutes, you could read the latest polling numbers from Israel. You could read the latest dispatch from the front. You could read the latest filing in the corruption trial. You could read the latest budget proposal with its legislative riders and its coalition compromises and its careful accounting of who owed what to whom. In 30 minutes of silence, you could hear the full weight of what had been constructed. A system in which war enables impunity. Impunity enables coalition. Coalition enables budget. Budget enables survival. Survival enables more war. And the loop continues, eating the future in small bites, each bite separately defensible, the whole unspeakable. The silence lasted half an hour. Then the trumpets began. Book Roman 3. The four horsemen, recast for a contemporary audience. Horseman the first, conquest dressed as liberation. The first horseman rode a white horse and carried a bow and was given a crown and went forth conquering. In the contemporary update, the white horse was Air Force One, or whatever the equivalent was, the specific aircraft of American executive power, painted with the flag of a country that had also, in its way, never stopped believing it was destined to win. The bow was rhetoric. The arrows were press releases. The crown was the Electoral College. Trump rode this horse with the conviction of a man who believed that his presence at a situation was, by definition, an improvement of the situation. He arrived at conflicts and declared them resolved. He arrived at negotiations and declared them successful. He arrived at the Middle East and said, "Nobody's done more for Israel than me, nobody," and meant it absolutely, in the specific way that people mean things when they have constructed their entire identity around the belief that their impact is always positive and their intentions are always pure. He conquered by insisting on his own indispensability. He made countries need him by offering himself as the solution to problems he had, in some cases, helped create. He was, in this way, perfectly designed for the contemporary moment, which was a moment that had lost patience with the kind of leadership that admitted complexity and had decided to outsource its anxieties to a man who was never, ever uncertain. Horseman the second wore the useful kind. The second horseman rode a red horse and took peace from the earth. This horseman did not need to be renamed or updated. War was war. It rode the same horse it always had. It smelled the same. It sounded the same. It produced the same results: bodies, displacement, grief, the specific moral injury of survivors who must continue to live inside the machinery that took the people they loved. What was updated was the apparatus around the war. The way the war was managed, narrated, packaged, distributed, and consumed. In the age of the Trump-Netanyahu romance, war had a press strategy. War had talking points. War had approved and unapproved framings. War had a relationship with the news cycle that was not accidental, but architected, timed to particular moments in domestic politics, amplified or quieted depending on what the political situation required. The Red Horseman rode, and the war was real, and people died real deaths. And also, simultaneously, in parallel, in the same moment, in the same headlines. The war was managed by men for whom its political utility was never entirely absent from the calculation. Both things were true. Both things had always been true. The difference was that in 2025, the management had become so sophisticated, so integrated into the architecture of modern political communication, that the distinction between fighting a war and using a war had become almost impossible to locate from the outside. This was the Red Horseman's greatest innovation, not the scale of the killing, the smoothness of the justification. Horseman the Third, Famine, the Attention Economy Edition. The third horseman held a pair of scales, and in the ancient text, the scales weighed food, and the food was scarce, and the people were hungry. In the updated version, the scales weighed information. The scarcity was not of facts. There were more facts available to more people than at any point in human history. The scarcity was of coherent narrative, of the kind of continuous, sustained attention that allows a person to look at a complicated situation across time and understand what is actually happening. Trump had mastered the attention economy, the way a conquistador masters territory, not by understanding it, but by being willing to operate by its rules, with fewer moral reservations than the competition. He flooded the zone. He said contradictory things. He said true things and false things in the same sentence. He created a constant atmospheric condition of noise in which fact-checking was technically possible, but humanly exhausting, in which accountability was achievable in principle, but practically unsustainable, because the target moved constantly and the audience was tired. Netanyahu had learned from this. Or perhaps they had learned in parallel, two students of the same political moment, reading the same textbook that had been written collectively by 20 years of social media and the transformation of democratic discourse into a performance of democratic discourse. The famine was of understanding, and in this famine, both men thrived. They thrived because confusion was their natural habitat. Because in a world where nobody knew quite what was true, the man who spoke with absolute certainty filled the vacuum. Because in a world where every institution was suspected of corruption, the man who said I alone can fix it found willing listeners in people who had, not entirely without reason, lost faith in the institutions. The scales tipped. The people were hungry. They were fed explanations that felt like food, but were not food. Horsemen the Fourth, death and hell, FOLLOWD, with HIM. The fourth horseman was death, and hell followed. Hell was not a place. Hell was a system. Hell was the accumulated, layered consequence of a political culture in which survival had been optimized to the point where accountability had become the exception, in which the machinery of democracy had been mastered so completely by those inside it that it could no longer reach the people it was supposed to restrain. Hell was the soldier in the field while the exemption bill passed in the Knesset. Hell was the judge reviewing the latest motion to delay, while the phone call from Mar-a-Lago echoed in the headlines. Hell was the citizen looking at the ballot and understanding that the choice was not between accountability and impunity, but between different styles of impunity. Hell was the knowledge that this was not unique to Israel, not unique to America, not unique to this moment, that this was the chronic condition of democratic systems everywhere, the creeping normalization of the extraordinary, the bureaucratic management of what should be outrage into what becomes, over time, simply the weather. And hell followed, because hell always follows, because death creates the conditions for hell, the way rain creates the conditions for flood, not inevitably, but with a consistency that a person paying attention would recognize as pattern. The fourth horseman rode through the news cycle. By noon, he had been replaced by a different story. By evening, he was a trending topic. By midnight, he was archived. He would return tomorrow under a different headline. Book Roman 4, The Whore of Babylon, a digression on branding. The text of Revelation devotes considerable attention to to the whore of Babylon. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of Harlots and Abominatins of the earth. This figure, the great harlot who sits upon many waters, who makes the kings of the earth drunk with the wine of her fornication, has been interpreted variously across 2 millennia as Rome, as corrupt religion, as imperial power, as capitalism, as America, as everything that seduces and corrupts and makes the world complicit in its own destruction. In this telling, the whore of Babylon is a brand, not a woman, not a city, a brand, the accumulated mythology that surrounds power and makes it legible, desirable, aspirational, inevitable. The brand that says, this is strength, this is winning, this is what the world looks like when the right people are in charge. Trump was a brand long before he was a president. He had spent 30 years constructing it. Gold, glass, his name in letters, 6 feet high on buildings. He had leveraged to the edge of bankruptcy and beyond. He had turned his own persona into a product and sold it everywhere from reality television to stake to the presidency of the United States. Netanyahu was a brand too, though a subtler one. The brand was the man who survives, the man who has been through everything and emerged, the man who cannot be broken, the man who may be imperfect, may be legally complicated, may have made deals that sit uncomfortably in the light, but who is, in the final accounting, still here, which in Israeli political culture is a kind of virtue in itself, the virtue of the man who persists in the face of enemies who want to end him. 2 brands, 1 alliance, and the brand of the alliance was strength, was nobody messes with us, was we have each other and we have our countries, and we have the weight of Western civilization behind us, and let the courts say what they will, let the headlines say what they will, let the historians say what they will. We are here, we are winning, we have won. This was the seduction of their romance. This was why it worked, why it kept working, why people kept tuning in, because the alternative, the thing the romance displaced, was uncertainty, was complexity, was the acknowledgement that there are no clean answers, that the war is both necessary and exploited, that the leader is both embattled and corrupt, that the ally is both valuable and dangerous, that the world is not divided into the strong and the weak, but is instead a continuous spectrum of compromise and consequence in which no one's hands are entirely clean. And the best you can do is try to do less harm than the alternative. But that doesn't fit on a hat. And the brand did. Book V, The Great Tribulation, or What It Costs. And one of the elders answered, saying unto me, What are these which are arrayed in white robes? And whence came they? And I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest. And he said to me, These are they which came out of great tribulation, and have washed their robes, and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. This is the part of the story that is hardest to write, not because the facts are unclear, they are not, but because the tone that has served the story thus far, the high satirical register, the biblical cadence, weaponized as irony, begins here to feel inadequate because the tribulation was real. The cost to Israel. Israel is a country of 9 million people. It has fought for its existence since its founding in circumstances of extraordinary complexity and violence, and it has survived, and it has built extraordinary things: scientific, cultural, democratic institutions that are genuinely remarkable given the conditions under which they were built. And it has also done things that are not remarkable in any positive sense, things that are the subject of international law and human rights documentation, and the specific, uncomfortable moral accounting that a democracy must perform about itself if it is to remain one. The cost of the Netanyahu-Trump romance to Israel was this: the further erosion of the distinction between the state and the person who ran it, the further normalization of the idea that a prime minister's legal jeopardy was a national security concern, the further weakening of the judiciary as an institution capable of reaching powerful men, the further entanglement of American support with the political survival of a specific Israeli politician rather than the security of the Israeli people. These were not abstract costs. They accrued on the ledger of Israeli democracy in the same way that debt accrues, invisibly at first, then undeniably, then catastrophically. The cost to America. America's cost was different. America's cost was the further installation of the principle that presidential friendship is a foreign policy instrument, that the United States' relationship with its allies is a relationship between leaders, not between peoples, not between institutions, not between the values that the United States nominally exports as the justification for its extraordinary global influence. When Trump called Herzog a disgrace, he was not making a statement about Israeli politics. He was making a statement about what American power was for. He was saying, American power is for protecting my friends. American power is for advancing the interests of the men I talk to every day. American power is a personal resource, extended or withheld based on personal loyalty. This was not new. American presidents had done versions of this before, but it had rarely been stated so plainly, so publicly, so cheerfully, with the tone of a man who did not understand why anyone would think this was unusual. The cost was the credibility of the idea that American power was bound by anything beyond the preferences of the man who held it. This credibility, once lost, is not easily recovered. Ask Rome. The cost to the dead. The dead do not receive itemized bills. The dead are simply dead. But if they could have received a bill, the soldiers, the civilians, the people on all sides of all the borders who died in the wars that these political arrangements enabled or prolonged or failed to prevent. The bill would have read as follows: to the dead from the system ray, your death. Your death has been reviewed and has been determined to be X, a necessary consequence of security requirements, an avoidable tragedy, the result of political decisions made in service of personal political survival. All of the above. Your death has been incorporated into the following political narratives. X, the security crisis that justified the postponement of the trial. X, the emergency that permitted the coalition to pass without new elections. X, the war that gave two old men something to talk about every day. We thank you for your service to the political process. Your sacrifice has been noted. Your sacrifice has been useful. Book Romans 6. The New Jerusalem, which looks suspiciously like the old one. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. The New Jerusalem in Revelation is the promise at the end of the catastrophe. After the seals, after the trumpets, after the bowls of wrath, after the beasts and the harlots and the armies gathered at Armageddon. After all of this, a new city descends, clean, perfect, without tears, without death, without the machinery of power and the grinding of consequence, and the long, exhausting work of human beings trying to organize themselves into something that resembles justice. The New Jerusalem is the promise that the catastrophe is not the final word. In this telling, we must be honest. We have not reached it. We are not near it. The New Jerusalem is not descending. What is descending is the next news cycle. What is descending is the next phone call. What is descending is the next emergency that will be used to justify the next exemption, the next delay, the next suspension of the normal rules in service of the extraordinary situation that has become, through repetition and insistence, simply the situation. The New Jerusalem may exist. Probably it exists somewhere in the accumulated dignity of all the people who looked at the system and decided to push back, the judges who continued to hear the case, the journalists who continued to cover it, the citizens who continued to show up in the streets, the soldiers who continued to serve without the protection of political friendship, the lawyers who filed the motions knowing the motions would be delayed, the historians who are, right now, somewhere, writing down what is happening so that it cannot be entirely erased by the people who benefit from its erasure. The New Jerusalem is built by those people. It is built slowly. It is built against the wind. It is not yet visible from here, but it is being built. Book Romans 7. Hell 2, complete feature list and terms of service. Hell 2 was launched in beta approximately 2016 and went into full production release around 2023. It has since received several major updates and numerous hotfixes. Key features: the eternal trial, a legal proceeding that never ends, but never resolves, maintained in a permanent state of pending, that serves simultaneously as proof of persecution for the defendant's supporters and proof of impunity for everyone else. The eternal trial is optimally configured to run in parallel with the defendant's continued exercise of power, creating a perpetual motion machine of grievance and governance. The useful war, a military conflict that is simultaneously genuine and instrumental. The useful war requires real enemies and real stakes, because fake wars cannot provide the authentic urgency needed to justify the suspension of domestic accountability. The useful war is not manufactured. It is merely managed, shaped, timed, narrated, and extended in ways that serve political rather than purely military objectives. The coalition of the indebted, a governing alliance held together not by shared vision, but by shared dependency. Each coalition partner receives something in exchange for their votes, and the thing they receive is always, in some way, an exemption from military service, an exemption from normal budget constraints, an exemption from the civic obligations that apply to everyone outside the coalition. The coalition of the indebted is stable so long as the leader can continue to distribute exemptions. The moment the exemptions run out, the coalition collapses. The transatlantic friendship, a bilateral relationship between two leaders that functions as a force multiplier for both. One leader provides the feeling of indispensability. The other provides the weight of superpower backing. Both receive something they need. Neither is required to consider what the relationship costs the people who are not party to it. The permanent emergency, the most essential feature. The permanent emergency is the condition in which normal rules are suspended, because the situation is too urgent to permit normal rules. And the situation is always too urgent, and the urgency is always genuine in some respect, and always serves the leader's interests in some respect. And distinguishing between the two has become so difficult that most people have stopped trying. The cuckold, the end user, the citizen who accepted the terms of service without reading them, and is now living inside a system optimized not for their security, or their prosperity, or their justice, but for the survival of two men who found in each other the perfect accomplice, terms of service, by continuing to exist within the political systems governed by either party to this romance. The end user agrees to the following: that the trial of the leader is a distraction from the crisis that the leader's decisions may have helped create, that the exemption of certain citizens from civic obligation is a necessary concession to coalition arithmetic, that the friendship between leaders constitutes a foreign policy, and that foreign policy is a personal matter between friends, that security requires the suspension of accountability, and that the security requirement is permanent, and that therefore the accountability suspension is permanent, that all of the above is temporary, that all of the above is patriotic, that all of the above is fine. The end user may not opt out. The opt-out button has been removed in the latest update. Epilogue, the beast, annotated at length. The beast in Revelation is the final adversary. It is given power by the dragon. It is worshipped by those whose names are not written in the book of life. It makes war on the saints. It is given authority over every tribe and people, and tongue and nation. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. The number of this beast is not 666. The number of this beast is 4 years, the duration of the trial so far, 18 seats. The ultra-Orthodox votes that held the coalition hostage to the yeshiva exemption, 64 seats, the size of the coalition that made it possible. 2 men, the authors of the romance, 1 phone call per day, the frequency of contact between them, during which the world was interpreted, and the interpretation was acted upon, 0%, the portion of their calculus devoted to asking what this would cost the people not present on the call. Infinity, the number of times this has happened before, in different countries, with different names, with the same logic, the same mechanics, the same result. Here is wisdom. The wisdom is not in the condemnation. The condemnation is easy. It is, in fact, the easiest thing in the world, easier than governing, easier than maintaining a coalition, easier than fighting a war, easier than prosecuting a leader with the full weight of a functioning democracy behind you. The wisdom is in the recognition that this system, the loop, the exemptions, the mutual dependencies, the permanent emergency, is not a bug. It is not an aberration. It is not the result of these 2 specific men and their particular ambitions. It is the output of a global political moment in which the machinery of democratic accountability has been outpaced by the machinery of democratic manipulation, in which the people who are best at exploiting democratic systems have gotten better at it faster than the systems have gotten better at restraining them. The beast is not Trump. The beast is not Netanyahu. The beast is what becomes possible when men like Trump and men like Netanyahu find each other, and find that together they can do more of what each of them does separately, which is to make the extraordinary seem normal, the temporary seem permanent, the personal seem national, and the cost seem worth it. The beast is the system that creates them, sustains them, requires them. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and in that new heaven and new earth, the trial had concluded, and in that new heaven and new earth, the young men who could serve, served, and those who could not, could not. And the reason was medical and not political. And in that new heaven and new earth, the leader of a country and the leader of another country talked to each other about the things that mattered to the countries, and not about the things that mattered to themselves. And in that new heaven and new earth, the phone call was recorded, and the recording was public, and the public understood what it heard, and what they understood, they did not forgive, and God wiped away all tears, and there was no more trial, because there was no more need for trial, because the thing that makes the trial necessary, the ambition that outlives its mandate, the power that exempts itself from consequence. The emergency that never ends had ended, and the Lamb opened the book, and for the first time in a very long time, the book contained the truth. The end. This story is a work of political satire, written in the tradition of prophetic literature, which has always found its sharpest language not in neutrality, but in the specific fury of someone who looked at the world and refused to pretend it was acceptable. The dead are not satire. The dead are the reason the satire exists. Remember the dead, and then change what is killing them. And the Spirit and the bride say, Come. And let him that heareth say, Come. And let him that is athirst come. Revelation 22:17. Everybody calls me Donald J. Trump.